A formidable power emerged from the Scandinavian lands, whose astonishing adaptability proved to be a true technological marvel of its era. These people were not bound by the ties of a single king or central government. Instead, each Norwegian village existed as an independent entity, proclaiming its own ruler. However, when the hour for daring expeditions arrived, the Vikings displayed remarkable cohesion. Leaving women and children behind, they fearlessly set out onto the open seas. Their insatiable hunger for treasure invariably dictated their weaponry and tactics. Among the first to experience the full brunt of their raids were the defenseless monks of Lindisfarne, a sacred abbey dedicated to St. Cuthbert. In June 793 AD, St. Cuthbert's monastery at Lindisfarne was rightfully considered one of the most devout and simultaneously wealthiest places in the British Isles, abundant in both spiritual values and immense material riches. On that fateful day, as the monks rang the bells calling everyone to morning mass, unknown ships, like creatures of nightmare, burst forth from the depths of the sea, bearing the terrifying visages of dragons. They descended upon the abbey like a destructive storm, mercilessly slaughtering the defenseless servants of God, plundering priceless relics, and setting sacred structures ablaze. The monks who survived this hell often described it as if devils from the underworld had been unleashed upon them, bringing unspeakable terror and destruction. That the Vikings were formidable warriors was beyond doubt. Their very existence was permeated by a drive to sow fear and dread wherever they trod. They were, first and foremost, raiders, not soldiers in the traditional sense. They distinguished themselves by extraordinary ferocity, insatiable greed, and astonishing combat prowess. Although many contemporaries regarded these Northmen as barbarians, their battle formation and disciplined, almost military, advance toward their objectives often inspired deep admiration. A Viking warrior was an extremely effective and terrifying fighting machine, a large, muscular Scandinavian, often clad in simple leather armor. Each was armed with remarkably unsophisticated yet lethal tools, a knife, a sword, and a battle axe. And, as ancient chronicles attest, the battle axe was considered the most fearsome of these weapons, as Vikings possessed incredible skill in throwing it, capable of striking opponents with deadly accuracy, beheading them or completely incapacitating them. Monasteries located along the coast were particularly attractive to Vikings due to their immense treasures and the defenselessness of their inhabitants. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun in the late 800s and a crucial source for English history from the 5th to the 11th century, vividly describes the terror caused by Viking incursions. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne by plunder and slaughter. This attack on the monks and their treasures in 793 AD marked an ominous historical turning point, signifying the first major Viking raid. However, Lindisfarne and other vulnerable monastic settlements along the British Isles coast were merely a prelude. As the 8th century drew to a close, Viking eyes turned towards much larger targets. The powerful cities of Europe were about to feel the full might and fury of these Northmen and their formidable ships. The Vikings left their Scandinavian lands driven by a singular purpose: plunder. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 AD ignited a devastating fire of Viking barbarity that threatened to engulf the entire European continent. By the mid-9th century, just 50 years after the tragedy at Lindisfarne, rumors of Europe's incredible wealth had spread far to the north. Families, entire villages, and communities united to collectively build the legendary longships, Drakkar. They formulated grand plans, seeking to significantly improve their material standing at the expense of those living across the sea. Much like the Spanish centuries later sought gold upon arriving in the Americas, the Vikings deliberately sought silver. Silver held the greatest value for them, as many religious objects, crosses, and various sacred vessels found in monasteries were crafted from this precious metal. The numerous Viking detachments crossing the sea lacked a single supreme ruler to unite them. Even as their fleets swelled to dozens of ships, each contingent continued to operate independently, making it incredibly difficult to counter their onslaught. As the reputations of individual chieftains rapidly grew, so too did their boundless ambitions. Europe became their boundless prey. The European continent boasts a unique geography. It is crisscrossed by a dense network of rivers, almost every one of which was navigable, unlike North America or Africa, where only a few rivers reach such scales. In Europe, there were many, allowing Vikings to launch their vessels on virtually any major waterway. Their ships, famously narrow and long, required minimal depth. One of the first large-scale riverine assaults occurred in 845 AD, led by the legendary and terrifying Viking chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok. With a fleet of 120 ships, he developed the tactics tested at Lindisfarne with truly monstrous force and directed them towards an attack on Paris. Before reaching the city itself, Ragnar's Vikings mercilessly crushed the French vanguard on the banks of the Seine, dooming their French captives to agonizing deaths. They were, in essence, skilled terrorists, deliberately employing terror as a potent weapon to break the enemy's will and ease their path. They preferred not to do more work than necessary, so they strove to be as terrifying as possible. There was even a famous Viking cynically known as the child lover, because he did not toss infants into the air to impale them on his sword as they fell. Overall, their deeds were truly monstrous, and their reputation sinister. The local monk Ermentarius meticulously documented in his writings the unstoppable Viking onslaught and the unprecedented destruction that continued for decades along the Seine and other rivers. The number of ships in their fleets steadily grew. The inexhaustible tide of Vikings never ceased to inspire dread. Everywhere, Christians fell victim to mass murders, arsons, and merciless plundering. Vikings ruthlessly conquered everything in their path, and it seemed nothing in this world could halt their devastating march. When a massive Viking fleet descended the River Seine and headed towards Paris, a powerful and seemingly impregnable city, the King of France, residing in Paris, instead of engaging in a decisive battle and risking the destruction that a direct confrontation with the Vikings would inevitably entail, chose to pay off the unwelcome invaders. King Charles the Bald of France paid Ragnar a colossal sum, nearly 6 tons of silver and gold, to compel the raiders to leave and never return. However, this decision had the completely opposite effect, as news of such incredible bounty instantly spread throughout the north, and now the Vikings knew that the lands of Europe were full of untold riches. The plunder of northern Europe continued with unprecedented might and fury, foreshadowing new calamities for the entire continent. Between 790 and 1100 AD, fearless Vikings penetrated deep into the European continent, mastering every significant river and waterway. However, an entirely new, uncharted world awaited them. It was the Norwegians, being audacious seafarers and explorers, who inscribed perhaps one of the most vivid chapters in the annals of the Viking Age. Their expeditions led to the colonization of vast territories, Iceland and Greenland, and then they continued their westward journey. Associated with these daring conquests is the story of 2 legendary Norwegian Vikings, Eric the Red and his son, Leif Erikson. In the late 980s, Eric the Red became the first to venture into settling the harsh land of Greenland. Possessing a rather fiery temper, Eric was soon forced to leave Iceland for 3 years. He steered his longship west and established a settlement on Greenland's eastern coast. Remarkably, he actively promoted this land, even though he couldn't directly state its limited habitability. We only have a small stretch of coast suitable for dwelling. Instead, according to legend, he claimed, "We have Greenland. It is covered with untold riches. Come and see for yourselves, and then return home." Nevertheless, many strong, resilient, and steadfast Vikings remained, facing extremely severe conditions. The land proved not overly fertile, but was abundant in fish and game. Under Eric the Red's leadership, this North Norwegian agrarian society struggled greatly to eke out a living in this remote world. For effective governance of their settlements, Vikings gathered at the Althing, a type of public assembly or court, a tradition carried over from their homeland. At these gatherings, free people had the right to speak in their own defense and discuss matters concerning the entire community. It was from this community of free people that Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, emerged. Like his father, Leif was eager to explore new horizons. In 1000 AD, he embarked on a sea voyage, following a rumor. There was a record of another Viking who, previously en route to another colony in Greenland, had been blown off course by a storm. When he managed to reorient himself, he found himself off the coast of a land surprisingly green and lush. Yet, it is known that Greenland was neither green nor lush. This is a fascinating question that still generates much debate. However, according to common belief, America was discovered by Vikings around 1000 AD. For instance, Leif Erikson's village in Newfoundland, discovered by archaeologists, was carbon dated precisely to 1000 AD. Thus, the Viking presence is confirmed in at least Newfoundland and likely even further south. The attempt to establish permanent settlements in both Greenland and the Newfoundland colony lasted only about 10 years. However, 500 years before Christopher Columbus made his epic transatlantic journey, the Vikings had already established a connection between the eastern and western hemispheres. After wintering in Newfoundland, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland, bringing something new to the islanders' lives. Using the same tools with which they built their legendary longships, the settlers began constructing sturdy crosses, symbolizing a new religion. They decided to convert to Christianity. It is known that Leif Erikson visited Norway, where the king personally asked him to bring Christianity to Greenland and facilitate the Christianization of the colonies, which he diligently carried out. As Viking influence expanded, the wider world, in turn, began to shape their own culture. Leaders gradually embraced Christianity, seeing it as a powerful means to unite disparate clans and, ultimately, to establish tighter control over them. At the dawn of the 11th century, 200 years after the famous attack on Lindisfarne, the northern peoples still lacked a single king and felt only a weak sense of solidarity. Christianity, therefore, represented a potential basis for their unification. However, Christian Vikings faced significant resistance from their pagan kin, who adamantly refused to abandon their ancient gods. Kings began to adopt Christianity because it served their political interests, helping to consolidate power. As a result, they started to impose the new faith on their subjects. This process was accompanied by numerous conflicts. People resisted, unwilling to abandon their old customs and fearful of change. Some Christian missionaries arrived on the island and, wandering through it, converted only a few. The majority remained skeptical. Once, it was decided to conduct a test to compare the power of the pagan deities and the Christian God. For this, a representative of the pagan deities was chosen, known as a berserker, a man who could be described, to put it mildly, as somewhat insane. Christian preachers challenged him. "We will light a fire, and you, pagans, will light yours. If the berserker can walk through your fire but cannot walk through ours, then we will know that Christianity has triumphed. If he cannot walk through yours, then we will know that paganism has won." This event almost resembled a duel from the Old Testament. Historical sources report that the Viking berserker easily walked through the fire lit by the pagans, but could not overcome the flames created by the Christians. Thus, all present were convinced that Christianity was the true religion, and many joined the new faith. Meanwhile, in Norway, the great catalyst for Viking unity manifested in the fate of one young man. Harald Hardrada, King Olaf of Norway's half-brother and heir, at the age of just 15, fought on the losing side in a Viking civil war. However, Harald returned with the intention to seek revenge and write his own history, stained with the blood of his enemies. Vikings spread across Europe like a deadly plague. Initially, defenseless monasteries became the targets of raids, but soon Viking invaders spread terror across the entire continent. Ultimately, internal strife divided the Vikings themselves, plunging Norway into a maelstrom of civil war. In 1030, the Battle of Stiklestad pitted forces loyal to the then Danish ruler Knut the Great against the troops of the Norwegian King Olaf in a deadly clash. From the crucible of these internal conflicts emerged a young warrior, Harald Hardrada, Olaf's half-brother and legitimate heir. By the mid-11th century, as Harald matured, he developed ambitious aspirations to lead and unify Norway, but first, he needed to acquire the necessary influence. Harald was truly an extraordinary individual. His path as a Viking warrior, if you will, began at a young age, when he was just 16. Wounded in the very battle that ultimately cost his royal brother his life, he was forced to flee. Harald Hardrada found himself in forced exile, venturing into distant northern lands. His journey led him first to Sweden and then to Kiev, a prosperous commercial hub located in present-day Ukraine. In 1031, he followed the route of Swedish Vikings who, over the preceding 2 centuries, had established thriving trading posts there to gain access to exotic Eastern goods. The Swedes initially arrived as ruthless conquerors, but over time, they remained to become merchants. Through trade, Kiev served as a bridge between northern Europe and the vast eastern lands. When archaeologists unearth buried treasures from this period, they discover coins from various corners of the world, as well as artifacts resembling miniature Buddha statues and fragments of ancient heads, eloquently testifying to the connections between these peoples. These connections and the pervasive cultural exchange held far greater significance than mere material wealth. Harold understood that without a reliable market for his spoils, his influence would remain limited. Vikings had thrived on trade for hundreds of years. When a warrior raided a dwelling, seizing numerous sacred vessels and ancient manuscripts, he wouldn't simply take them home. The question arose, what to do with them? He needed to travel somewhere and convert these trophies into necessary resources. However, material valuables were only a part of the extensive trade network. Vikings were also actively involved in the slave trade. As slave traders, they exchanged men and women captured during their plundering raids. Women in those times died during childbirth with shocking frequency, necessitating a continuous replenishment of female resources. They abducted young women, took them away, undoubtedly subjecting them to violence, and then transported them to slave markets for sale. Despite the harsh lessons of economic reality, Harold did not limit himself to commercial avenues for accumulating wealth. He also had to embrace the role of a warrior and master the skills that would make him king. By 1038, Harold was confident in his abilities and hungry for spoils. Commanding an elite contingent of Viking warriors, he fought for foreign rulers in the east, amassing untold riches and solidifying his influence, preparing for a triumphant return to Norway to seize the royal crown. In Sicily, Harold demonstrated his unparalleled ingenuity. Harold's military prowess was characterized not so much by outstanding valor as by sophisticated cunning, a key trait of the Vikings. Rather than simply resorting to brute force, they preferred to use trickery whenever possible. One of his tactics was as follows. When they approached a besieged settlement, he ordered his men to catch small birds that flew in and out of the city. Then, using flammable tar and thin ropes, they tied small smoldering branches to the birds' backs and released them. The birds flew back into the city, to their nests, and the thatched roofs instantly ignited. Thus, they managed to capture the city. In Harald Hardrada's saga, the 13th century Icelandic skald and historian Snorri Sturluson recounted the effectiveness of this strategic move in the conquest of Sicily. All the inhabitants came out of the city, begging for mercy, he wrote, the very people who for days had hurled insolent curses at the army and its leader. Harold granted life to all who asked for mercy and established complete control over the city. After nearly 15 years, the skillful Harold had amassed an impressive reputation and immense wealth, necessary to finally lay well-founded claims to his fragmented homelands. In 1046, he returned to Scandinavia, a renowned mercenary with the wealth and ambition of a king, but as yet without an official title. As the next in line for the throne of Norway, he was ready to assert his rights. The problem was that his nephew occupied the throne. To reclaim it, he had to resort to astute diplomacy. What did he do? He was a highly shrewd politician, so, of course, he reached an agreement with his nephew that they could rule jointly. This worked. The nephew passed away a year later. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Harold killed him, though, certainly, suspicions have been voiced in his direction. Harold remained in Nidaros, and ultimately, it was Harold who now solely ruled Norway. Having consolidated his claim to the throne, Harold yearned to establish his undeniable hegemony. In 1047, he commenced the systematic extermination of his opponents, employing a ruthless combination of strategic maneuvers and personal vengeance. Harold unleashed an unbridled fury upon all who dared to defy him. In 1047 AD, after many years of gaining power, Harald Hardrada ascended to the Norwegian throne. He governed his Viking subjects through overt force. Harold's men displayed mercilessness as they devastated the homesteads and settlements of those who opposed him. Their message was simple and uncompromising: submit or face death. Throughout the vast country, those subject to Harold paid the ultimate price for their disloyalty. In the annals of Harold's saga, the monarch himself openly declared his ruthless nature and untamed cruelty, uttering the following words: "I kill without remorse, and remember all my killings. Treason must be suppressed by any means, otherwise it will consume me." The oaks of rebellion grow from the acorns of betrayal. Once the flames of rebellion were finally extinguished, it was time for a triumphant celebration. King Harold's loyal companions flocked to his sprawling longhouse, preparing for a grand feast worthy of a conqueror. In Viking society, possessing significant wealth, especially in the form of gold, was a cornerstone of influence and power. For it was the generous distribution of these treasures among his followers that allowed chieftains to gather and sustain their armies. It was necessary not only to provide warriors with sustenance, but also to lavishly reward them with gold, as precious metals were their primary motivation. The bestowal of a gold ring for valor or the gifting of a luxurious golden goblet served as a powerful incentive and a mark of recognition. Thus, the accumulation of immense treasures was vital. It was the abundance of wealth that elevated a person to the position of an influential leader. This encompassed Harold's entire strategy, whose palace raids were aimed at maximizing his gold reserves. A true Viking jarl or konung was a figure capable of attracting people not only through force, but also through the charisma of his personality. He had to possess an impeccable reputation as an invincible leader, capable of leading his warriors to glorious victories, ensuring not only plunder, but also their survival. This is why warriors gathered in these vast halls, where grand feasts were held, where gold was generously distributed, and mead flowed like a river. And while from time to time these gatherings might evolve into preparations for another raid or campaign, at their core, they represented a great Viking banquet, serving as the pulsating heart of their social life. Within the walls of the Great Hall, political intrigues were woven, strategic alliances were forged, and supreme power was exercised. This system was remarkably flexible, allowing Vikings to adapt to any circumstances, quickly reorganize, and change course. However, it was also extremely fragile. The fall of a leader, whether through death in battle, humiliation, or other misfortune, could instantly lead to a complete change of power, where a completely unexpected contender might rise to his place. Inspired by Kiev's prosperity, King Harold made the strategic decision to establish a major trading center in one of the key coastal cities, where goods from all corners of the known world could converge. The choice fell on Oslo, a city destined to become one of the most significant ports in this vast region. The monarch was well aware that commercial activity could not only unite the disparate Viking clans, but also bring them much-desired wealth and long-term stability. In Oslo's bustling markets, goods produced in the Viking dominions themselves were offered in abundance, from plentiful wheat and fresh vegetables to valuable furs and quality textiles. Aboard the famous Viking longboats, exotic goods arrived in port from the most remote corners of the then-known world. Aromatic spices, gleaming gold, exquisite fabrics, rare precious stones, and even slaves. Germanic pottery and glass artifacts found buyers in exchange for intricate silver jewelry brought from France and coins minted in distant Arab lands. Thus, the once formidable Viking warriors gradually transformed into skilled and shrewd merchants. With each passing year, Oslo grew and prospered, and the daily life of this dynamic trading community was reflected in artifacts discovered in burials, alongside intricately engraved golden weapons, rich ornaments, and even simple wooden idols belonging to the Vikings themselves, lay ordinary trade goods. However, the creation of a thriving trading center only amplified Harold's insatiable appetite for even greater riches and absolute control. King Harold concluded that he needed a goal of a much grander scale, and that enticing objective became England. And so he embarked on his vessel, followed by an entire fleet of ships. His expedition, of course, was joined by the rebellious brother of the English king, and Harold Hardrada, known for his unwavering determination, set forth. Viewing England as his future prize, Harold undoubtedly envisioned his own vast empire, its borders stretching as far as his swift longships could carry him. Once in exile, he had managed to gain incredible power and undeniable political influence among his warlike people. He had already crushed the most powerful of his internal Viking enemies, and his subsequent actions met with only minor resistance. England, with all its immense wealth, seemed an easy conquest, ready to fall into his iron grip. However, Harold and his brave warriors were about to encounter a much stronger and more disciplined army, and the impending struggle promised to be incomparably greater than any he had faced before. By late September 1066, a messenger arrived in the ancient city of York, bringing extremely alarming news. The formidable Viking king Harald Hardrada was relentlessly approaching their lands. The English were well aware of his reputation as a ruthless conqueror. It became evident that only lightning-fast action and unparalleled bravery could halt his advance. Harold began his invasion from the coast, and after a rapid succession of bloody clashes, his triumph seemed almost inevitable. York itself, it appeared, was ready to capitulate. Harold, with a detachment of his warriors, headed towards Stamford Bridge, located approximately 7 miles from the city walls. He was convinced that the leaders of York would come there to express their submission and offer hostages as tribute. So great was Harold's self-assurance that northern England was already in his hands that he brought only a portion of his forces, and even they left their heavy armor behind, deeming it unnecessary. However, the English did not share such complacency. Their own king, Harold Godwin's son, swiftly led his soldiers on a forced march through the dense forest, aiming to cut off the Viking army. His swordsmen were clad in reliable chainmail, and his archers were well armed, ready for battle. When the English army suddenly appeared, according to saga accounts, the Vikings were utterly stunned to see armor gleaming in the midday sun, relentlessly approaching them. At first, they couldn't understand who it was, but as the distance closed, the truth became apparent. As described in Harold's saga, for the Vikings, the sight was like an ice sheet, as thousands of weapons shone with a single gleam. At this critical moment, Harold made a fatal decision. Instead of retreating in an organized manner and awaiting reinforcements arriving from his ships, he chose to engage in battle.